Hello, everyone. This is Vince Versace, National Managing Editor of the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce, joining you today. And with me is Andy Manahan, President of Manahan Consulting Services, longtime Daily Commercial News Editorial Advisory Board member, and also a Senior Advisor at Strategy Corp. Andy, thank you for joining us on this first ever election night broadcast brought to you by the DCN and JOC.
Great to see you again, Vince.
Yeah, great to see you too. So wanted to talk to you tonight. Now, this is a recording. We're recording during the day. So full disclosure to the viewers, right? This is before the polls have closed, but we're holding this chat during the day because it's going to be a busy night for everybody. And I know you and myself, policy and political wonks. So, we want to have as much attention on the television and the results as possible. But I wanted to talk to you because of the longstanding kind of expertise that you can bring. You've brought it to our readers and our listeners on the podcast in the past around infrastructure and transit and housing investment. So I wanted to get a flavor from you on some of those topics. So I hope you're ready to go.
Okay, I'll give it my best shot.
All right. So really, describe how you think the issue of infrastructure, like what kind of attention has it received? Has it received the attention that one would expect, considering all the other issues that are at play right now during this election campaign?
I would say that infrastructure is a given for the most part. During the pandemic, it was recognized certainly by the Liberal government, but also by the opposition parties that infrastructure investment is really important to get people working again. Other sectors of the economy, such as hospitality and service, were decimated. Construction did relatively well. So I think it was recognized by our political leaders and parties across Canada that infrastructure is really important. So infrastructure really wasn't a priority topic during the campaign. There were other issues that I would say were related to the jobs and economy, and there were certainly differences of opinion on childcare. How do you get more women into the workforce? So those types of issues were indirectly related to economic growth, post-pandemic, and how do we deal with things. Very little talk about transit investment. I think in the spring, certainly when Catherine McKenna was infrastructure minister, she did make some announcements about, the 4 priority projects in Toronto, and certainly the Hamilton LRT was a priority for her. Those types of things, and electrification of buses across Canadian cities, those were all infrastructure related, but that talk sort of died down over the last 36 days.
Mm-hmm. That's what we found here too, as we've kind of followed it along, hunting for the construction stories on the campaign. Typically, one of our go-tos is always the debate around infrastructure and transit investment, and gas tax funding for municipalities. That it just never seemed to kind of pick up as a hot topic. From what we could see on our end.
I would say that housing became one of the top 5 topics during the election campaign, with people using phrases like "this is a housing crisis." Young people are never going to be able to afford, to either own or rent. Most of the platforms were around home ownership, but they seem to be juicing demand rather than thinking more so about the supply side. I'm just saying in general terms. There was some talk, for example, about rent subsidies of $5,000. Talk about foreign buyers tax of 20%. Some of those things symbolically I think are important, but they're not really important issues in terms of increasing supply that's really needed. Even though we have been at a pretty good clip in terms of building, my concern is that once we get out of this pandemic and immigration numbers start trending upwards again, it's going to be even that much more difficult to keep up with the shortage of supply, which is, as it's not really a federal issue. There are certain things that can be done, like the federal government might have some land that they can open up that might be able to encourage through incentive programs municipalities to do things in a different way, but it's really at the local and provincial level where housing policy and delivery is paramount.
You tell you and I have done enough work together and interviewed each other. You beat me to my next question. Nicely done, Mr. Manahan. Well, it was just about that. how much can the federal government really do when it comes to housing? Is it really, are there carrots that they can provide for provinces and municipalities to jump on? Because that's where the rubber hits the road on that topic, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, some of the discussion was around the stress test, and I can understand the concern because, we have seen inflation tick up over the last little while, beyond the Bank of Canada's band of 1 to 3%. We've seen 4% plus inflation. Will interest rates follow at some point with the Bank of Canada? That's a great unknown. But the stress test, again, is another one of those issues that it's important to ensure that people who are entering the housing market for the first time can maintain making the mortgage payments over time. But again, it's not going to generate the kind of supply that's needed. So I can understand, where the governments are coming from with those sorts of questions. But again, that did not really become a hot topic in any leaders debate or anything of that nature. There was some discussion that, certainly the Conservatives made, and I think they probably tore a page off of, the Ford government in Ontario with respect to linking transit. So, this is transit-oriented communities where a developer would, in return for helping to build a station, would get higher densities around that station. So I think that O'Toole and party picked up on that particular one. The Conservatives also said things about, deferring capital gains for rental properties so that more money would be reinvested in the rental. So that's probably good for economic growth, but it's not really helping housing affordability. It's just, generating more construction jobs. So, it might be good for the developer community to think about it, but for the average individual or the household, you're not going to be lowering rental prices with that kind of an approach.
True. There was a story recently over the weekend where there were some highlights brought to about somewhere in the Maritimes, can't remember, from New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, about some housing projects that were enabled by some federal funding of some kind, but they weren't really affordable homes as far as the rent that they were going at. And,
right.
But it's, everybody can make a lot of points during a campaign, right, off of headlines like that, and but trying to understand a bit more how much a federal government can do versus a provincial and municipal sometimes might be asking a lot of a voter, right? So to understand that.
Well, there's an interesting statistic that I came across. So especially around the GTA with the hot housing market that we've had, and the average prices have increased over the last 5 or so years from around 600,000 in the GTA to well over $1 million. And to be able to afford that kind of an increase, even if you couldn't afford $1 million house, you'd have to have an annual income growth of 18%. So, the housing price escalation far outstripped the ability of people to afford that housing. So, the bank of mom and dad in some cases helps, but, that's a small slice of the overall solution.
No, for sure. And was there anything that surprised you as far as on the platforms on this topic of housing? Like, I'm thinking about, like, the Conservatives as well were kind of targeting foreign buyers. That was a bit of a hot topic once, But was there a plank or anything that under the housing initiative that kind of caught your eye from any of the parties? Something that was
if I recall, the Liberals were talking about a rent-to-own program. I think O'Toole tried to use this as a wedge issue because I don't really think the Liberals were planning this. But O'Toole said, we'll never place capital gains on your primary residence if you sold it. Because I think the Liberals were making comments with respect to, those people who are flipping and perhaps not intending to stay in that residence. So, some of those things get taken out of context, during a debate just for, argument's sake.
And then as far as the debate too, I mean, it's a question we've been asking people we've been talking to. For yourself, as an expert in the field, did you get anything out of that federal leaders debate, the English speaking one? And we're just kind of getting the pulse from people that we've talked to, was it substantive enough? Was there anything in there for you?
Well, there seemed to be a general consensus that the English debate was probably the worst of the three leaders debate, and the one that was probably more damaging to the Liberals may have been the moderator's question with respect to Bill 21, which is in the courts right now. So, that's going to play out over time, but it was certainly used by the Bloc Québécois as something that could be used to help the Quebec nation, so to speak.
Right.
So, in terms of the dynamics of the parties, I think in early September, the Conservatives were a little bit ahead, and O'Toole was trying to become more moderate on certain issues like gun control. And maybe even the climate change policy in terms of the targets and so forth. And I think his base didn't really follow him. And so some of those people, I believe, shifted to the People's Party of Canada, the purple signs that we've seen here and there across the landscape. 7% across the country, 10 to 11% in Alberta and some of the prairie countries. And to me, we could go on and on talking about, specifics of policies, but I think emotions ran this election more than anything else. And there was a lot of anger and frustration. I was down in Niagara Falls on the weekend, and driving into the falls, I saw a street corner with people holding up purple signs. One of them which read, "Stop the madness." And I completely, empathize with that kind of frustration. What I don't adhere to is kind of, the anti-vax, or Max Bernier certainly said, I'm not going to support mandatory vaccines or vaccine passports, and for whatever reason, they seem to catch on. So for the Conservatives, I think PPC is probably going to, it depends on the riding and the regional breakdowns, but it certainly takes some of the Conservative votes away.
Funny, in our lifetime, we've seen the right eat itself once already in Canada. Think back to the days of Stockwell Day and the Reform Party, and the true breaking of the progressive conservative brand at the federal level, and the Harper conservative rising. And it's interesting to see it. Here we are, almost at the precipice of that cycle again. It feels like it a little bit, right? Like the right is starting to eat itself again, but this time it's actually, yes, okay, I'm going to give you my opinion. And it's a bit more of the extreme right that seems to be eating the core conservative now, right? And it's funny to see that twice already, so soon in our lifetime. And what does that mean? What does that mean?
Well, certainly, I think it was in London, Ontario, where that person threw pebbles at Justin Trudeau, and I think all the party leaders, rightly so, came out and said, there's no place for that in Canadian politics. We may have major disagreements, but name calling and stone throwing is not really part of the Canadian way.
Yeah, it is. And maybe that's probably the disheartening part. I know it's not really, for our construction artists, they probably will rail against us, saying, what do you mean? You're missing the points, but it isn't the way we do things here. But they would tell us, no, this is the way it has to be done now, because we have to be listened. And it's been interesting to see. And it's been interesting to see how construction's been trying to deal with it, because we do see a bit of a divide between the owners and the guys on the ground on site on certain issues, especially around vaccinations. In fact, we've had some comments sent our way because we ran a poll via our social media, the DCN and JOC social media, just around mandatory vaccinations at work sites. And, one of the comments was, you're rigging the poll to, to make this happen, to push this mandate forward. It isn't going to work, essentially, paraphrasing it. I'm like, Lord, if I only thought we had that much power. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Right. We're just getting a flavor, but that spoke to the demographics. You know what I mean? So,
and again, we saw protests in front of hospitals rather than in front of, political offices or Queen's Park or Parliament Hill, that sort of a thing. So, take your protests to where they belong. Don't interrupt people that are trying to do their job in the healthcare sector.
No, exactly. Whether you believe it or not, it's actually happening within those walls and those, ERs and with the ICU beds. The strain is there. You know what I mean? So Well, back to our topic. I know people are
Yes.
listening to us for the construction, and so, but this is that in a microcosm. This is our conversation we just had right now. Is the challenge these parties and these leaders have had
Absolutely.
with this campaign, right?
Yeah.
Because it's all about pretty much the pandemic and vaccines, and but there's a lot of other issues that drive, and the economy is the big one. The spend.
Yeah. And I think, some of that anger, whether it's PPC or otherwise, came out because, and all the leaders have said this, so it's nothing new, but, did the Liberals make a strategic error in calling the election during the pandemic? Trudeau said he needed a mandate, but he seemed to be getting most of his major planks through with NDP support. Obviously, his unstated goal was, securing a majority government, but definitely in hindsight, this is a big risk for him. And who knows exactly what the slices are of the polls right now and how the seat count's going to line up, but I think it's highly unlikely that Liberals are going to get 170 seats, which is needed for a majority out of the 338. I think the CBC poll that I looked at this morning said that there was a 17% chance of a Liberal majority, a 57% chance for a Liberal minority. So that seems to be most likely at this stage. 25% chance for a Conservative minority, and only a 1% chance for a Conservative majority. So in essence, I think this country is going to be harder to govern post-election, because people are going to be angry that $600+ million looks like it was wasted in terms of a result that's more or less the same.
It is. I can't see it. Just for having a conversation, I don't see a majority government either way, Conservative or Liberal. It's just, and the ebb and flow, like you're saying, of what happened with the Conservative brand and Mr. O'Toole from the beginning to now. Like they've been been weathering a bit of a storm. You know what I mean? Opinion wise and popularity wise, the last week and a half. So any inroads they would have made, I don't see it happening.
So they're roughly at 31% each, but the seat count is probably going to differ more dramatically than that percentage.
Right. Oh, interesting. So, in the end, do you think there was a moment at all during this campaign where the fortunes turned for any of the parties? We kind of talked a little bit how things changed a bit for O'Toole, but how about for Trudeau, Mr. Singh? Did you see any moments that were their pinnacle moments, and then things kind of changing for them, good or bad?
Yeah, I mean, the Green Party had already shot itself in the foot with their internecine warfare before any of the leaders' debates. So I think that was unfortunate. And the Greens couldn't even, muster up candidates in all 338 ridings. I think it was 230 something. But if you watch, Annie Paul during the debates, she came across in a very articulate way. So, in hindsight, if they had got their act together, they probably would have been a little bit stronger, but I'm trying to remember what their polling is, but it's something like 3%. So, whether they hang on to their 2 seats or not, so they're not going to really make a big difference in this particular campaign.
It's true. I remember during that debate, it was the impression I came away was she had done exceptional. You know what I mean? She just jumped on. With the opportunity she had, she jumped at it, and she was articulate. She made her points across. The exchange between her and the Bloc was a little interesting as well. How you may want to interpret the question or not, and her reaction to it all. But it felt that we're back to the format, talking about that debate format. There wasn't the big counter punch that could happen. Because at times I found all the leaders were debating the moderators instead of each other, right? And I felt we kind of were cheated as viewers.
That's right. Yeah.
So, all right. So as we wrap up,
climate change, because it is oh yeah, sorry. I was
go ahead. Yeah, climate change.
Yeah. Should have been the big issue, and there's infrastructure overlap with that particular one. But again, it was relatively nuanced. The Liberals said we'll cut emissions 40 to 45% below the 2005 levels by the end of this decade. NDP said, 50% below current levels or 2005 levels by 2030. And the Conservatives said we'll stick with the Paris Agreement. which is a big change because, so to me, that was, O'Toole was trying to bring the party along with respect to carbon pricing. May not have been the best plan or most fully thought out plan, but certainly, he appeared to be more enlightened with respect to something needs to be done. Canadians want to see things done with respect to protecting our environment. This particular summer, there was wildfires and droughts and all those sort of, clues that things are not really normal, and they haven't been normal for a while in terms of, temperature increases. So, what are they going to do about it? I thought that could have been, a better debate in terms of how do you link, more resilient infrastructure and dealing with, the climate issues.
For sure. And actually, you just reminded me, there were 2 points I'd written down here. Climate change to talk about with you, but as well the second one, just before we go, as we wrap up, the Canada Infrastructure Bank. It has a different fate depending on who wins, right? The Liberals seem to be committed to continuing with it, but the PCs and NDP sound like they would end it. So
they would pull the plug from what they've said.
Yeah. So you were involved, you talked about the CIB, I remember my staff would interview about it. Has it been working in your estimation? Does it deserve a refresh, a restart? What do you think on the issue of the infrastructure bank?
The criticism that's come from the Conservatives, from my understanding, is that CIB, you said that you would get more private sector investment. We haven't really seen the level of private dollars come into these projects that we thought. There's some very good projects, agricultural issues in Alberta, electrification of buses, energy in southwestern Ontario, all those sorts of issues. I think they're good projects, but it's taken longer, I think, than people thought. What would the Conservatives do if they came in? Certainly, when I spoke to someone in Andrew Scheer's office, who was the infrastructure critic, said that, what happened with P3 Canada was the question I had. And, so this is the problem. Like, I think you can improve on the Canada Infrastructure Bank rather than dismantling it entirely. So my recommendation would be, and I think that, post-election, this is where the associations and other advocates have to just start knocking on the doors in a big way and try to influence policy. Don't do anything too rash right out of the gates, because we've seen that before. P3 Canada was dismantled in favor of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Would the Conservatives, if they got a minority or whatever, go back to a P3 Canada type of, format? I don't know. But when you got whipsawed like that, it's not good for policy certainty, and it's really not good for a pipeline of projects.
For sure. Excellent, Andy. Well, look, thank you so much for making time today on election day. As we mentioned, this interview will run in our broadcast, and if you're seeing it now, you are seeing it run in our live broadcast stream tonight. So we thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Great to see you again, Vince.
Great to see you too.